Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. The episode you're about to listen to, I didn't really mean to do. I thought I was about done with my election coverage. And then I ended up just casually writing out a few notes, which, without even realising it, turned into a whole episode, which you're about to listen to. You may well be listening to this after the election, but I think what I want to say will be relevant in both cases. It's kind of a rant of mine, but it is a rant that is coming from a lifetime in activism and having covered this, in some detail for the better part of a decade now. I won't do much of a preamble. I've just finished recording and it's kind of tired me out to do it. But yeah, this is kind of like my final words on that. So this is the US Body Politic. Say the worst happens. Say the American Republic as a somewhat liberal, somewhat democratic system phases out and we enter a period of fascism or far-right authoritarianism. How will that look 500 years from now? How will it look 1,000 years from now? How will they explain that? What questions will they ask of that? Here's one I think they'll ask. Or I have a scene in my head that an undergraduate at a university 1,000 years from now, this might be quite a standard question that they get on their History of Political Thought exam. Why did a system that had such strong built-in checks and institutional guardrails against democratic excess and the concentration of power fall so quickly and so easily to far-right authoritarianism? Why did a system in many ways designed and structured to prevent such an outcome prove utterly unable to meet it when it did in fact arise? It wouldn't be unusual for future peoples to scratch their head over this and to debate it. Many, I'm sure, would take debates from their own society and read the dangers of them into the past, and many would just admit a sort of confusion. Historians still debate why the English Civil War happened, for instance, and a lot will say we actually kind of sort of don't know why the English Civil War happened, or the fall of the Roman Republic. Since time immemorial, we've sort of said, oh, well, the Roman Republic fell because of this, or it fell because of that, or sometimes we just say it just seems like a set of processes that just happened, and we're kind of not sure why. That's looking back. The thing is, the people at the time found it difficult. If you'd have asked Cato or a Caesar or Cicero why what was happening, you'd have got very different responses from them depending on the individual or when you were asking them or just what sort of mood they were in that day. People at the time didn't really know why what was happening. In the same way we kind of don't know now. I think a lot of people are just not really facing, as I discussed at length in my Getting It episode, I think are just not really facing the possibility that things can go badly wrong. But of the ones that are, there's a confusion, if not a bewilderment. I'm recording this before the election, and people ask, I just don't get it. I don't get how we're at this point. You might be listening to this after the election, in which case either Trump will have won or Harris will have. But either way, the question is still pretty pertinent. If Trump won, then really how did we get to this point? After a coup attempt, after everything that happened in his presidency, after the criminal trials, after everything we know about him, and just the openly fascistic platform that he's running on, how did he get elected? And even if Harris wins, this was still way, way, way closer than it had any business being. How was it? This should have been a 20-point blowout, not a 2-point squeaker. And those are the outcomes that I think we're looking at. I don't know the future recording this, but I don't think, whatever happens, I don't think we're looking at a 20-point or even a 10-point Harris blowout. I would obviously be delighted if that happened. I think it's certainly possible she might beat her polls by a bit. I think it's possible Trump might beat his polls by a bit. I think it will not be a landslide by any normal definition of the term. And so I was thinking, what I might say in a post-election analysis episode, and I realised my analysis will actually be kind of the same. Whether we win or not, that we are at this point, now 3 cycles in a row with Trump on the ballot, poses some hard questions for us. If we lose, I think we are in trouble. I don't think it's irrecoverable, but certainly that will be very, very challenging. And even if we win, I don't think we can assume that the danger has passed. And so I kind of thought it might be better to just do my post-election analysis before the election. Because I think there's a way of, you can sort of retrofit your analysis to events. It might be quite good to just put it out there beforehand. And like I say, I don't think it changes. I think what I want to say will be true regardless of the result, unless the result is an absolute democratic landslide in which we get an overwhelming popular vote lead and a governing trifecta with large majorities. Unless that happens, I think a somewhat sombre analysis is warranted. And that's what this episode is. So let's return to our students sitting their political theory exam 500 years from now, trying to scratch in the back of their heads from the lectures on the American Republic that they only half listened to, and they're presented with the question, why did a system with such strong built-in checks and institutional guardrails prove so unable to use them when the time came? What should that student say? It's just another way of asking what we should say. Here's what I think. I think when you get a question that seems profoundly counterintuitive, like if X, why not X, you often want to go and ask, what are the assumptions of that question? What model of the world is being proffered here? And is that right? Does that fit? And this is just so the value of the history of political thought and history in general, and, understanding different philosophies and different perspectives. It's sort of challenging us to take off the glasses we've been wearing for so long that we forget that we're wearing them. And I think no matter how serious and how heavy the topic, there should be a playfulness and open-mindedness and experimentation with how we pick up and try on different pairs of glasses. There should be a carefreeness to it. It's not about ponderously labouring through tomes of texts by old dead white men. It should be a playground, a sandpit. What do I mean by the glasses that we've had on? There tends to be a model of how particularly American democracy functions that assumes certain things, and you can hear it just in the language of how people describe it. I was watching on CNN some interviews with undecided voters, and some of them were alright, some of them were every bit as bad as you expect. And this one guy said, I'm not worried about Trump being anti-democratic because the system has strong guardrails, so even if he runs against them, he'll hold them. I'm not voting on that. I'm voting on things like investment in clean energy. Now, on its own terms, that is a stupid thing to say. Like, for one thing, you're voting on clean energy and you're undecided? What? But for another, okay, and for another, even accepting the sort of visual metaphor of guardrails, that doesn't seem like a smart way of thinking. Like, my apartment's on the 5th story, it's got a little balcony. I'm looking at the guardrail on that, and it seems pretty robust. It seems like if I threw myself at it, it's made of steel, it would probably hold me. I don't know that I don't know that certainly enough to bet my life on it. So I'm not going to throw myself against it. Throwing myself against it seems like a really, really bad idea. But, okay, I'm ragging on that guy a bit. But he's expressing himself through a visual metaphor that makes certain assumptions, right? And that's not at all unusual. In fact, it's more or less inevitable. Because political and social systems are so big and so complex and we can't really wrap our heads around them, we tend to metaphorically think of them in terms of other systems that to some degree we can wrap our heads around. Physical systems, mechanical systems, biological systems. So, for instance, you might metaphorically think of society as a machine. I've argued, and I'm far from the only one, that the metaphor that's in the back of a lot of people's heads here is what you could call a Newtonian paradigm. Here's a quote from The Method is Ideology, from a Newtonian to a Heisenbergian paradigm in economics. Quote, "The Newtonian paradigm used in classical and neoclassical economics interpreted the economy according to a pattern developed in classical physics and mechanics, a closed autonomous system ruled by endogenous mutually independent factors of a highly selective nature, self-regulating and moving towards a determinate, predictable point of equilibrium." End quote. Now, that's in the context of economics, but it's a similar thing. So in economics, you have bounds of the system. You have a state enforcing property law, say, right, within which these particles, people, move according to the motion of individual rational self-interest. And within those external bounds, just like planets will end up orbiting a sun in predictable equilibrium, people will, supply and demand will reconcile, and markets will clear, and equilibrium will emerge. That is a Newtonian paradigm for the economy. I think we think about American democracy in something like the same way. There are institutional constraints and guardrails within which these planets or atoms ping around, i.e. individual political actors and factions and parties, guided by a desire to rational self-interest, win power, and the system itself will balance that power against other power. It will have competitive elections and so on, and through the operation of these atoms pinging around within these institutional guardrails, a sort of equilibrium will emerge, which is beneficial policy, or at the very least, policy that doesn't concentrate power and become authoritarian. I think in both the economic and the political cases, that is the visualization, often unconsciously, often without realizing it, that we have in the back of our heads. Now, it's not the only way that we can metaphorically visualize political, social, economic systems. And it's not always been the dominant one. I would say through the first half of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, the dominant way of visualizing social systems was using evolution as a metaphor. Darwin's theory of evolution was hugely influential in the political sphere. Survival of the fittest, as a phrase, didn't come from Darwin. It came from a sort of proto-libertarian, Herbert Spencer, who was using it to describe society. And it wasn't just libertarians or conservatives, liberals did it too, as did socialists. You had like Bernstein's evolutionary socialism. Everyone was talking in those terms. It became quite a lot less fashionable to do so after the Second World War because the Nazis were very, very big on talking in evolutionary terms. I want to go back a bit further though. Not even to evolutionary. I want to use a biological metaphor that's even older, the body politic. This will probably be most known to you from Hobbes, and probably from Hobbes, not even from a quote, but from a picture, the frontispiece of Leviathan, where, if you haven't seen this, look it up, because it's one of the all-time great covers in all of history, but I imagine a lot of you will know what I'm talking about, where the king is represented as a huge being, composed of many smaller beings. The pieces in his armour are all individual men making up his body. So this is the metaphor of the body politic, in which the state is conceptualised as a human body, and all of us are, in modern terms, I guess we could say, the cells, the component parts of it. And it lends itself to some wonderful metaphors. So there's a famous Hobbes quote where he says corporations are, quote, worms in the body politic, end quote, which, regardless of exactly what Hobbes meant by that, is just a wonderful, evocative image. Hobbes is actually probably at the tail end of using this metaphor. Historians date it back generally to Aesop's fable of the belly and the members, which has sort of personified different parts of the body and is very open to political readings. I would argue there's kind of a loose body politic metaphor in Plato's Republic, where he talks about the head and the stomach, the rational and the appetitive, the appetite parts of the body. There's, the parts of the state that think, and there's the parts of the state that eat, which is his sort of way of thinking about the class structure. You find it in the Bible. Paul is very influenced by Greek and Roman philosophy, and he at many times conceptualizes the church as a body, sometimes as a body in Christ, but sometimes he's just trying to think through, like, how a complex association of individuals works, and he finds the metaphor of a human body quite useful. So this is from 1 Corinthians 12, 14 through 23. Again, when he talks about a body here, he's thinking of it metaphorically for a church. So, quote, "For the body is not one member, but many. If the foot shall say, because I am not the hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear shall say, because I am not the eye, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where were the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where were the smelling? But how God hath set the members, every one of them in the body, as it hath pleased him. And if they were all one member, where were the body? But now that there are many members, yet but one body, and the eye cannot say unto the hand, I have no need of thee, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. Nay, much more those members of the body, which seem to be more feeble, are necessary, and those members of the body which we think less honourable, upon which we bestow more abundant honour." End quote. So the metaphor's very clear, right? He's saying there's lots of different people within the association who have different functions, and all are part of the association, and all are needed. What about the US case? Let's again assume that all of us in the US, or I suppose those of us who are citizens but not currently in the US, are cells within a body. And I think this makes the seeming paradox a bit easier here. Again, these are just metaphors, right? But they can be more or less useful. I think the Newtonian metaphor for the US is consistently not useful, in that it tends to produce seemingly paradoxical results. How can a system with such strong guardrails just beat the guardrails? Well, maybe the problem is thinking of it as guardrails. Like, maybe that's the issue. Now, and also, as I say, these are glasses that we've had on so long that we stopped wearing them. I don't think people think I am using a Newtonian metaphor. I think the language of guardrails just sort of comes to mind. And again, this is the value of history of political thought, and you can go, what if we had a sort of ancient body politic metaphor? Let's take off those glasses and try on another. How does the US look through the glasses of the body politic? Well, it's still counterintuitive, right? On the one hand, the US body seems to be a very strong one. It is militarily the most powerful state that has ever existed in human history. I don't think there is any army today or in world history that could beat the current US army in open warfare. So if it's a body that's ripped and does MMA, right? It's also seemingly quite healthy. It's not a body that's frail or injured. For all that we talk about inequality and economic frustration, there is inequality, certainly. There are very poor people in the US, there is economic frustration. But again, we have to be real here, I think. If that's what's leading to fascist outcomes, then no liberal democracy anywhere has a chance. Europe has much lower wages, maybe slightly more of a safety net than the US, but even so, not really, in a lot of cases. If the US, the most prosperous state in human history, which has an incredibly high median standard of living by world standards, if economic inequality is leading it to fascism, what hope do the rest of us have? So, in the body politic terms, we have a young, healthy, physically impressive, almost intimidating body that nonetheless seems to be fighting for its life against an illness. That's how I'm going to visualise Trump and the MAGA movement in this. They're a virus. And this is something we struggle with, right? How do we... On the one hand, Trump and that movement just is so dangerous. On the other, it seems like it shouldn't be. That, this is what's going to take down the great American Republic? The most powerful state to have ever existed? The You're Fired reality TV guy? That's how it happened? But I think if we think of liberal democracy as a body, this begins to make sense. There are processes the body runs that are long-term, and there's processes that are continual and have to be continual. The heart has to keep beating. The lungs have to keep breathing in and out. You can maybe get a little period where your heart stops or you're short on oxygen, but more than a few minutes and that's it, Likewise, I'd say there's things liberal democracy does that are holding regular, generally free elections with a generally universal franchise, right? They have to happen regularly, not because they always deliver good results, but because other systems within the body sort of depend on them to keep beating, right? As we discussed in my interview with Samuel Eli Bagg, that regular elections kind of just disperse power and just force it out and stop it congregating and congealing at certain points. If regular elections are the breath of the body, Trump is like a respiratory illness, right? Like a respiratory virus. And here's what I would say, and here's the metaphor I'm going to use. The US body politic is a strong and physically able body. And in ordinary circumstances, dealing with this respiratory virus shouldn't be that big a deal. The body has ways of protecting itself, and we have an immune system that we will get viruses from time to time. There will always be illiberal elements within a liberal system. but they will just sort of get taken care of. You can think of this is, instead of guardrails, I'm going to talk about the immune system here. I think what's happened is, although the American body politic is a strong, young, able body, it's been unlucky in a certain sense. It's got this virus at a time when it is severely immunocompromised. So many of you will know there are things that will just, natural and artificial, that will just make the immune system of your body much weaker. Anyone who's had an organ transplant will be on a diet of drugs that make your immune system weaker. Some people naturally just have stronger immune systems than others. Some people go through periods where there's a low. But there's all sorts of things that your body does to fight infection, bacteria and viruses that can be at a high point and can be at a low point. If you're undergoing certain forms of treatment, if you're undergoing chemotherapy, for instance, the doctor will tell you really, really want to avoid even like getting a mild cold. Don't be around anyone who has one. That will do so much more damage to you than it would ordinarily, because your body isn't in a position to fight it off. I think that's a bit like where we're at. There's a lot of immune systems in a functioning liberal democratic body politic. I'm going to count 5 or 6 of them. And I think what's happened is, in the US at the moment, all of our immune systems are at a low ebb right now, at the moment when we kind of needed them. So in bodily terms, there's just like your first line of defense immune systems. You have skin, eyelashes to keep out foreign particles. We sneeze if we think our air tracts are agitated. We throw up if we think that we've ingested poison. The political body equivalent would be institutional checks, right? You have impeachment. You have a constitutional prohibition on insurrectionists running. You have constitutional norms. You have these sort of things written in the Constitution so that, like us throwing up to expel poison, the body politic can undergo an unpleasant, perhaps, but procedure to purge itself. Differently to thinking of this as guardrails, though, these are not automatic. They're not just pieces of furniture. These are things that the body politic can do. And hence they're things the individual parts, the cells, will have to do. And they're also not the whole story. In the immune system, these are the first line of defence. Liberal democracy has a number of other soft systems to protect itself with, but I think we can say that just like a physical body might not be capable, for whatever reason, of sneezing or throwing up to expel foreign pathogens, the US body politic is just not capable right now of using these sort of political institutional checks. I could do a whole analysis on why, but I think I can sum it up with a quote from, of all people, George W. Bush, the second one. He said, "The Constitution's just a bit of paper. Like, it's useful when the individual members of the body are motivated to uphold it. It's useful to have it clarified and written down. But there's plenty of instances where we've just, the Constitution says Congress needs to pass a declaration of war for America to go to war. It hasn't done that since the Second World War. We've all just kind of agreed that even though that's what's on the bit of paper, it doesn't really matter. In the same way as we've all just kind of agreed, with maybe a few holdouts on the Dem side, that the bit of the Constitution that says after engaging in insurrection you're ineligible to run for office, that just kind of doesn't apply. We technically think impeachment applies, but we haven't really used it. So that first line of defence doesn't seem to be online in the US right now. The body isn't capable of doing that, so it's going to be much more at risk of infection. You also, though, the body has natural mitigation, i.e., we sweat when we're hot. The body naturally heals itself. I guess in my metaphor, this could be something like public opinion. This has been very mixed, right? A lot of people are strongly opposed to Trump. And elections have been partially successful. From where I'm recording, we're 1-for-1 with a tiebreaker coming up. Also, social condemnation hasn't really come online. A liberal democracy, there should be not laws exactly, but a sort of bias of public opinion against overt racism. It shouldn't be the done thing in polite society. And to a degree that's happened, but to a degree it hasn't. This public opinion can be the most counterintuitive, but I think it exists within all of the others. It's acted somewhat to save the body, but it hasn't worked by itself, nor does the system really rely on it to do so. Just like us sweating when we're hot is not the only defence we have against a fever or a respiratory ailment, elections and public opinion are not meant to be liberalism's only ways of protecting the body politic. In fact, the whole US is very much designed around the assumption that they're not, that there will be bad election results every now and again, and other immune systems are needed to clear pathogens. Unfortunately for the US, one of our most important bodily immune systems is being artificially immunosuppressed right now. So as I mentioned, there's many drugs you can take that will lower the efficacy of your immune system, the sort of antibodies within you that fight viruses. And if you're on one of these drugs, which may be necessary for other reasons, you will be particularly vulnerable at that point. I'd say I use the metaphor of like artificial suppression here. When I think about the press and the mainstream media, I think they're going through a sort of artificially imposed transitional crisis period as we've had the internet, as we've had social media, and as we've had, political polarization and all of like what new technology has wrought. That has been very challenging for old school print journalism, for the Washington Post and the New York Times and so on and so forth. How do you adapt to that world? And I think as it's adapted, it's had to suppress some of its core protective functions. I think the press, there may be protective functions the body has that it's aware of and that it's not aware of. Individual cells don't necessarily know that they're a part of the liver. The press sometimes sees itself as having core protective functions, and it sometimes doesn't. But I think certainly when it comes to fighting a virus within the body politic, part of what the press should be doing is really calling attention to dangerous authoritarians. I don't want a press that is purely partisan. I don't want just a liberal Fox News, but the press should not be neutral on matters of fact, and it should not be neutral on the survival of liberal democracy writ large, i.e. the system which makes a free press possible in the first place. But it hasn't. The statistic that always gets me is that in the 2016 election, more press coverage was given to Hillary Clinton's emails than to all Trump scandals combined. I believe that the New York Times has devoted 7 times the amount of front-page space to covering issues relating to Biden's age than they have relating to Trump's criminal conviction and all of the various legal processes going on. Now, I'm not saying you can't cover Biden's age, and I'm not asking for them to be uncritical of Democrats, but something is wildly off in the priorities here. There was some controversy recently about Jeff Bezos ordering the Washington Post to rescind its endorsement of Kamala Harris. And I think that was telling. Other than pure political corruption and just acquiescence to fascism, even at its most generous, I think the press are very aware that they're losing the trust of conservatives, and they don't quite know what to do about that. And they kind of think, well, we need to balance our coverage. If we say something negative about Trump, we need to say just as many negative things about Biden, because if we don't, conservatives won't trust us, and then when we really need to sound the alarm, they won't listen to us. But I think what's happened is we've just got caught in a beam sea. We've got the worst of both worlds, in that precisely because the press is so concerned to hold the trust of conservatives, it finds itself unable to do the thing which is the nominal justification for holding their trust in the first place, namely sound the alarm when the alarm needs sounding. We have to hold conservatives' trust. We don't want to cry wolf, so that when there really is a wolf, the conservatives will listen to us. Well, there is a wolf. And just like the different immune systems of the body don't work in isolation, they work together, and one's failings impact others' failings. I think the failings of the press, the very obvious failings of the press, the urge to just both sides everything, the refusal to really talk about Trump in a way that's appropriate to the danger, the urge to kind of like whitewash and even sane wash what it is that he says, the urge to even just give it adequate coverage, to spend the same time covering the criminal conviction of a past president that we did to the fact that Biden's old and has senior moments. These seem at least of equivalent importance. The fact that the press is failing in those ways obviously interacts with other immune systems of the American body politic. It interacts with public opinion, with institutional responses, and, as I mentioned, with the justice system. The justice system has many roles within the body politic. One of them, not the only one, and not the one that we think of the most, is an immune system response. When people who are opposed to the functioning of the system try to destroy it, they will invariably do illegal things at certain points. No state is it legal to try and destroy the state, right? And this isn't unique to liberalism. Every body politic, at least every sort of state, has an immune system like this. You know, when Guy Fawkes tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament, you'd best believe he gets arrested and executed, right? Any state will use its monopoly on violent force to protect itself in that way. Except we're not. It seems to me that there's two things which make that immune system aspect of the justice system, you know, like I say, immunosuppressed, immunocompromised right now. One is that there's been a project for about 30 or 40 years now to really take over the justice system for the political right, and to ensure that key positions are held by partisan conservatives. This is most prominent in things like the Dobbs decision or partisan political decisions like Bush versus Gore, but it has also impacted the ability of the justice system to try Trump, in that a lot of the people judging those cases, like Eileen Cannon, the judge in the Documents case, are Trump appointees and are aggressive partisans, right? So that's immunosuppressing the justice system. I'd say there's been another thing, which is that there's been a drift in the American justice system. And I don't have like a whole theory of this. I'm not a historian of legal procedures. But it's always been the case that, like, being wealthy and having resources advantages you in the justice system. I'd say there's been an increasing tactic specifically where people can just grind the process to a halt. That the defence, particularly of people with connections or means, isn't to do the OJ thing, have great lawyers who win at trials. It's to keep on throwing up procedural faffing around, such that the trial never happens at all, or it just drags on for years and years. I was watching a documentary about, it's not really important, but like a medical malpractice case, and the hospital was sued, and the hospital hired this former circuit court judge and this very influential person and that, and they managed to just use procedural faffing around to keep the case out of court for like 5 or 6 years, and eventually the plaintiff seemed to just have resources and determination, and they stuck with it, and eventually, when it looks like it's going to go to court, they settle. But it seems like we've allowed faffing around to become a defence within our justice system. I actually know a couple of people who've pursued various legal options, and I won't go into the details because I don't want to put people's business out there. But what happened in all of those cases was the system, even when they were very clearly in the right and would eventually be vindicated by the system was kind of defenceless against faffing. The opposing attorneys would go, well, what about this obscure principle and whatever? And the judge, in almost every case, would get kind of flustered and be like, oh, okay, yeah, let's send that to another body to investigate that and make a determination, or maybe that needs to go to another court. And the result was something that should have taken 6 months took years. And this very, very effectively is the strategy that Trump has used. Faffing. Continual procedural bullshit. And I think the commentary from lawyers hasn't been good on the Trump legal cases, because what they've said is, oh, well, his argument that he's making is very legally unsound, and that's not how... It doesn't matter if it's legally sound or not. He's creating a mess so that it takes time to clean up the mess, and he just runs out the clock. What Trump did... Let's just take a very narrow case of the recorded phone call to Brad Raffensperger. Is straightforwardly illegal. Anyone involved in that or July 6th should have been arrested more or less as soon as Trump left office. And the convictions and sentencing should have happened within the year. And that is a protective function of the body that the justice system provides that just sort of has to work for any state. You think, you know, when the authorities caught Guy Fawkes with a bunch of gunpowder barrels in the Houses of Parliament, that if he were to go, oh, actually, there's a complicated legal dilemma here about the separation of powers, and allowed him to just faff on and delay execution for a decade, you think they would have done that? We talk about the right to a speedy trial for defendants. What this has made me realise is we need a right to a speedy trial for the state. When the state feels like its life is on the line, it needs to be able to move cases through the system. And this is the one area where I do really blame the Democrats. Like, I, in general, don't want to blame the victims. I think in general the Democrats have tried hard and done okay in a very, very challenging circumstance. Why there was such a reluctance on the part of, I don't think it was even Biden, from what I understand it was Merrick Garland, to prosecute Trump, I don't really know. Like, that should have happened quickly. In the UK, there was recently a series of racist riots in which people of colour were attacked, and at its absolute worst, mobs tried to set fire to a hotel with refugees inside, and thankfully they were evacuated safely. Our justice system snapped into action. Clearly, just a bit of chutzpah, a bit of effort, everyone was clearly on the same page. Now, that didn't involve a liberalism. It didn't involve suddenly, oh, you don't have the right to a fair trial, or, you know, we're gonna, you know... No. It's just, it happened quickly. Extra prosecutors were made available. Whatever, like, the shortest amount of time it was to get someone in front of a judge, that happened. And then whatever the longest amount of time they could be sentenced for, That happened. And you'd best believe if someone came along saying, oh, well, actually, I need to do a bunch of legal faffing around before we get to that, they wouldn't have had it. People still had the right to present a defence if you could show, no, actually, I wasn't at the hotel trying to set it on fire. You know, I was at home and here's all the people who'll vouch for that. I'm sure you would have been let off. But if you were there and we can prove that, then we're going to expedite that case and we're going to give you a maximum sentence. And that is an immune system response in the body politic. That's it doing what it needs to do. It's not violating rights, but we are going to move very quickly and very aggressively to quash this. And we know that's what works. We know that when it comes to deterring, let's even just say low-level antisocial behaviour, like people getting in drunken fights and graffitiing and that sort of thing, what deters it effectively is not just the severity of the consequences, it's the speed of the consequences. Is there an immediate response? Is there an immediate reaction to bad behaviour? That's what conditions people out of it. And when it comes to people trying to destroy the foundations of the state, that is what the justice system has to do. And the American justice system hasn't, through a combination of we've just allowed procedural faffing around to become a defence, and that the system itself is filled with partisan hacks. It's no longer really capable. And, to be honest, the Democrats, I don't know what Merrick Garland was thinking in delaying for 2 years on this. I really don't. That immune system just doesn't seem to be online right now, which is wild. Here's another immune system that's on a low ebb. The far left. Hear me out here, because I can imagine many people on the far left will say, what do you mean I'm an immune system to the liberal body politic and to the US body politic? I'm not trying to save the American public, I'm trying to destroy it and replace it with luxury space communism. I don't want the liberal body politic, I want to make it an android that has all these extra cool features on. Hear me out. Individual cells in the body don't necessarily have it. The liver cell doesn't know it's part of the liver. It just does things and contributes to larger systems. We on the far left do have a protective sort of antibody system in calling out and going after fascists. That is something we do that helps keep the body politic healthy and protects it. And it's actually sort of assumed. The presence of a far left that is aggressive and sometimes even a liberal is actually sort of assumed in the logic of liberalism. Idiot liberals are the sort of type who, like your most centre-right liberals, right? Idiot liberal is maybe a bit harsh, but they will say things like, well, if a business owner is being bigoted, you can protest that business. You can organise a boycott. Or, we shouldn't be shouting down speakers on college campuses. The solution to bad speech is good speech. So even in your most gratingly centrist liberal, but just notice something there. In those sort of, if the business owner's being bigoted, you can organise a boycott, or bad speech and good speech. Where does that good speech come from? Where do those protests come from? Where do those boycotts come from? That's the work of people. And those people will have to be lefty and radicalised, and they'll have to be possessed of an ideology that makes them motivated to do things that might not be, completely acceptable in polite society, that certainly will require a lot of effort and volunteer labour. And have you ever tried to organise a boycott against anything? It is really hard, right? And there is a presence within our society that is capable of doing these things, and that has, despite of its self-conception of speaking for a forgotten majority, actually has a disproportionate impact on public discourse precisely because they're so energetic and so loud and so angry. And that's not a criticism exactly, at least not in this context. That plays an important antibody response in the body politic because it creates consequences for far-right bigots. Or it should. My single biggest criticism, I talked about this with Matt McManus in the second part of my interview with him, with the socialist left these days, is it has lost its anti-fascist moorings. I was, at least on my mum's side, raised in a British socialist tradition. Generations of Labour voters, generations of people who saw themselves as ideologically of and for the working class. And one thing that always came through very strongly in that tradition is anti-fascism is non-negotiable. We are always, always, always opposed to racists, and that takes priority over anything else. We do not compromise with such people. We don't try and collaborate with them. We don't try and live with them. Coexistence with fascism is not possible, and it's good that it's not possible because it's not desirable. I think the modern American, probably the modern British too, far left has just lost that. Over the last 10 years, most of its energy has gone to challenging mainline liberalism. I'm not saying it should never do that, but the big thrusts of organising an activity have been around the Bernie 2016 campaign, around getting someone like AOC elected and replacing a mainline Dem, around, let's be honest, things like the Bernie or Bust campaign. I'm not saying there's never a time for that, but it's a bit like the cells in the body that should be attacking the virus are now attacking other cells that are part of the body. That has been a big part of this. Just, I mentioned the Bernie or Bust thing, that was determinative. There were enough people, it was very rare, as is often pointed out, that Bernie 2016 primary voters would vote for Trump, but it was quite common that they would abstain or vote for Jill Stein, and if even half of the people who did that hadn't, then Trump wouldn't have won. That's an electoral consequence. I think there's been a more general societal consequence, which is more diffuse and harder to measure and harder to just put a number on. But if you follow sort of socialist lefty accounts, which I follow many, a good number, maybe a majority, not all, but a good number, spend the vast majority of their energy attacking the mainline liberals. That is an antibody response that that would be very useful to have, and we kind of really just don't. I think many on the far left would say, are you kidding? We're completely powerless. I think this would have been very different had the focus been different. And I think that the great virtue of the rowdy left is we can marshal energy and enthusiasm. That we are the people who can generate protests and, yes, Twitter mobs. I think Twitter is a great example of that socialisty left is vastly disproportionately represented on Twitter, and in many ways that's a good thing. Or it would be if that power were being used responsibly. Now, to be fair, or at least to contextualise what's gone wrong with the far left, I said the idiot liberal will say things like, if a business owner is being bigoted, you can organise a boycott. And they just sort of assume into existence the energy and the just painstaking effort of what organising a boycott actually is. The idiot liberal certainly doesn't plan to do it. None of his idiot liberal friends will. Someone will, right? The Democratic Party really for a long time did not throw a bone to the socialist left, but sort of assumed that it would have its energy and activism, which it often did. I think 2008, Obama's first run, he definitely had the left behind him. And I think that's what goes wrong when we think about the functioning of democracy as a closed, impersonal, mechanical system. This is sweat, blood and tears that people put in. I don't think they necessarily put it in because they see themselves as an antibody protecting the liberal body politic, but that is nonetheless a function that they are serving, and we just sort of assume that their labour happens, and that is a lot of the frustration that the far left talks to, is they say the Democrats take us for granted. Liberals take us for granted. And that's a tough one to come back on because there's a good amount of truth in it. We do take the socially beneficial effects of having an energised far left for granted. And I think that is where, I don't think people would exactly say it like this, but a lot of the energy for the sort of activist rebellion on the left came from a feeling that they weren't being spoken to or listened to, and if anything, they were being disrespected. Like, if you go work, I've interacted with sort of national democratic campaigns going back to about the Obama first run. They will, unless you're very senior, they will pay you absolute trash. You will not have job security. You will obviously not be employed past the election. You will work in very, very demanding work conditions, and you'll be talked to with a general condescending arrogance, right? That is where the activist revolt of 2016, that was the Bernie campaign, came from. It just attached itself to Bernie. It could have God forbid, but it could have attached itself to much worse people. I'll say no more than that. So I do kind of get it, in a sense. Nevertheless, it did mean that when the body politic really had to fight off a virus, one of its immune systems was functioning at a low ebb, namely the sort of energy that the hardcore left should bring to opposing fascists. That wasn't there. It would have been if we were dealing with this in 2008. And it wasn't. And finally, you know what else you really need when you're ill? You ideally want to sneeze it out or throw it up. You need the body to naturally heal, to sweat it out. You need all the little antibody cells to fight it off. You know what you need? You need time to recover. Have you ever gone back into work too early after having the flu, and you just give yourself another week of it? And we're sort of in that cycle where we're continually trying to force ourselves back to work. And the thing is, we've just had so much else to work on, we being the American body politic. As we've been wrestling with fascism, we're also at another existential crisis of the environment. So in addition to everything else, the Biden administration had to, with deadlocked congressional majorities, pass a spending bill the size of the GDP of Italy to deal with climate change. We had COVID. That's a big crisis. And all of these things are going to be socially divisive. I'm not a degrowther. I don't think we all have to go back to, washing our own clothes and living off the land in order to fight climate change. But there clearly will be economic costs and trade-offs, and the transition to a fully renewable economy, while I think we need to do it, I'm not naive enough to think that that won't have losers, and that won't create division and resentment, right? That is a big challenge for the body politic to work through. Same with COVID. There's always going to be a trade-off between, the different costs imposed by, say, doing a lockdown versus not. But I think looking back, it's clear that those would always be divisive and always be difficult and always be something that it was challenging for our democracy to deal with. We've had two big wars recently. We had Ukraine, we had the Israel-Palestine war over the last year. And I think, America is at a point where, although it seems like American foreign policy is pretty locked in now, I think it probably will change over the next decade or so with respect to Israel. I think Israel has, without going through the whole history and the rights and wrongs of the conflict, I think Israel has behaved in a way that has significantly lowered its reputation abroad, and that whereas in the past it could rely on majority public opinion support in America, I think that's less and less true. But making the change from reflexively siding with Israel and always seeing them to be an ally, that's going to be, not that they're a massive strategically significant ally, but just people have very, very strong emotional attachments and identitarian attachments to both sides of that conflict. And regardless of how you see the conflict abroad, both Jews and Muslims are discriminated groups who are both victims of hate crime in the US, and anyone who has an anti-Muslim or an anti-Semitic axe to grind is just having a field day right now, right? All of which is to say, I think that is an immensely just difficult thing for the political system to work its way through. And I could go on. But the time that when we really should just be at home resting, that we've had to be dealing with all of these other things as well. And people say it. They say, I don't want to focus on Trump and the Democratic threat. Like, the main thing to me is the environment. And, like, I get it in a sense. But, like, in many ways, it would be nice to have had a period like the 90s, where, at least in Western states, things went wrong and happened, say, in Africa in the 90s. But at least in Western states in the 90s, we just had stable economies and, like, not much happening. And, the Labour government in the UK would get re-elected being like, what if we spent 1% more in schools? And they'd spend 1% more in schools and they'd win in another landslide. Like that, it would have been nice. Well, I would say it'd be nice if the far-right threat happened in the 90s. The thing is, it did. There were far-right movements in the 90s. They just didn't really get as far. They were important and harmful, but they didn't get to this existential threat level because all of these immune systems were online and the body politic had time to heal, which it hasn't in this case. The body needs time to rest as it's recovering from an infection, and it's just not had it. Like, I feel like the last 4 years in America, the last presidential term, is... Yeah, no, it's exactly that. It's you've had the flu, you go back to work before you're ready, you've done a million things at work, you've got some stuff done, like on the environment and so on, and on COVID, there's other stuff that you haven't got done yet, around, like, what policy in Israel or Ukraine should be, and then suddenly you're just sick with the flu again, and this time it might kill you. So... that is kind of my metaphor for where we're at. And I think that makes sense of this thing of, like, wait, why are the guardrails so strong and yet they're not working? Well, we'll stop thinking about it as guardrails. Start something mechanical and abstract and unmoving and artificial. Think about it as a human body. It is a strong human body, but every immune system we have, all the 6 different ways that the body might fight off a virus, are really, really weak right now. And now's the time that we've caught a virus. So, despite of the body seeming quite strong, a virus that we would ordinarily recover from easily enough may well kill us. And that is a strange, sad way for a superpower to die. I think it makes more sense as a way of looking. Again, it is a metaphor. The US is not literally a body. But... and it makes sense of, like, when people say it shouldn't be this hard. It shouldn't have got this far. I can't... no, it shouldn't. Imagine if any of those immune systems were working like they should. Imagine how different this would be if public opinion were different. If everything else is the same, but a candidate denying an election pays a 20% price for it instead of a 2% price. Or imagine where we'd be if our institutions were working as designed. If we could impeach for impeachable offences. If we could bar insurrectionists from running for office like the Constitution says we should. Or how different would this be if the press would cover Trump with the same zeal that they did Hillary's emails or Biden's age? Real bare minimum stuff, right? If they would devote a bit of energy and attention to this. I don't think he would have won in 2016. I don't think it would be this close now. Now, the press seem to feel like nothing they say makes a difference. That, oh, well, the reason we nag Dems is because Dems are responsive to criticism. You know you can't talk Trump voters out of it. That is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yes, a good percentage of the Trump vote is pretty locked in at this point, but the story of how we got here and how we got it so locked in is a story of media failings, and obvious media failings. Or if the justice system did its job in a timely manner, what if everyone involved in January 6th was arrested immediately, tried, convicted and sentenced within a year? Including the organisers and perpetrators. That seems wild to us, but it's bare minimum stuff. Like I say, would any other state, not use its justice system in the face of a violent coup against itself? Cicero was a blathery, self-righteous, sanctimonious slumlord. You think you dislike liberals? You would hate this guy. He at least had the wherewithal to execute the ringleaders of a plot to overthrow the Republic. I'm not asking for Che Guevara's, I'm asking for Cicero's, for God's sake. Or, if we had a real anti-fascist left, if the energy that's gone into running insurrections against mainline Dems was put into getting fascists out of office. Trump doesn't win in 2016, but for Bernie or bust. And what if we had real actions, big protests, boycotts, organising against prominent supporters? We have resources. We've shown that we can raise money, that we can generate energy, and we can call on huge amounts of volunteer labour despite our self-perception as powerless. We actually have an outsized role in political discourse. What if we were using it against the greater evil? Or what if even we didn't have a million other things that the body politic needed to work on? Even with all the other failings, even with all of our other immune systems running at really low ebb, I think we wouldn't be here if we'd had a bit of space to recover. So, of all the 6 different immune systems I listed, all for their own reasons, were all at a really low ebb about 10 years ago, and have continued to be at a low ebb since. And the liberal body politic will contract viruses from time to time. Just like the human body will get colds, you will get the flu. There's never going to be a moment where there's not any illiberal challenge to liberalism or anti-democratic challenge to democracy. But if any one of them had been working, I think we'd have just about got through it. Now imagine that they were all working. How easy would this have been to deal with? Imagine the institutions worked, the press was doing its job, the justice system was doing its job, anti-fascists were focused on actual fascists, we had time and space to rest. It wouldn't have been a challenge at all. That's how liberal democracy is supposed to be. That's why it's so surprisingly resilient. You'd think liberal democracy seems a bit wishy-washy and soft compared to the iron fist of totalitarianism, but it almost always outlasts it in practice and beats it militarily. Just like the human body can seem very frail, surely a person is just a lot squishier and easily injured and easier to get sick than like a robot. But robots break down and stall out all the time, and us human beings are surprisingly resilient. Because we live within a quasi-liberal system, it doesn't always seem that way. And I think particularly because we're in a system where the liberal body politic has none of its immune systems working, liberalism seems very weak to us right now. Perhaps not worth defending. People say things like, well, if liberalism can't see this off, is this really a system that has any future? Like, if we can't deal with a senile reality talk show host, what chance do we have? And that's fair enough if that's what if that's what a healthy liberalism was, but it isn't. We're not living in a healthy liberalism right now. So, what do? I don't think we're in a sort of solution space. I don't think there's an easy set of actions that gets us out of this. And I think that's true whether we win or lose. I think it's past that point. I think win or lose, we can start going through those immune systems and thinking about what we would have to do to bring them up to strength. I mean, first and foremost, we have to purge the virus from the body, which means defeating Trump, defeating other fascists at the ballot box. If we don't do that, then we are going to be working under real constraints to get those other immune systems up, because the virus attacks the immune systems. If we win, we're still in a position where the body politic has all of its immune systems down and is incredibly vulnerable, and there will be other viruses. So, I mean, I don't have the answer to all of them. I don't know how we make our institutions work and our justice system work, other than to tell our electeds that's what we want. On public opinion, I do think we're at the point where we need to start shaming people. I talked at length with this on the Rawlsianism and the far-right episode. So, that. I've also talked about reforming the far left a lot. I've banged on that drum a lot. And I've made that case because I think it's important. And I think, I haven't spent as long talking to conservatives because I don't have standing with them. I hopefully perhaps at least have some standing with the left that I can utilise. But I do think it's hard. I think one thing that falls out of this analysis when you stop thinking of it as guardrails and start thinking about it as an immune system is this is choices people make, and it's things that people do. And there's sort of an assumed labour, an assumed effort on the part of the far left. I think it has to be both ways. I think socialism and radicalism needs to recover its anti-fascism. I also think mainline liberalism, society as a whole, needs to think about how we can support that element within our society better, to not just assume that in the case of a bigoted business owner, someone will boycott him. I think that also can just be as practical as funding the far left. I think to the extent that there are people doing good work who are showing real, genuine anti-fascist bona fides, they just give them money is a start. Similarly with the media, I haven't spent as much time on this on the podcast, but maybe a few thoughts. There was recently a big I think 250,000 people unsubscribed from the Washington Post because they withdrew their endorsement of Harris under pressure from the owner, Jeff Bezos. I think that's good. I think, at the end of the day, media often comes to us as if they're charities, and they're not, they're businesses. When Trump was elected, the Washington Post ran on, democracy dies in darkness. In other words, saying the press has a vital immune system role within the body politic, and we need you to keep funding us. And liberals were very susceptible to that ask, right? I think it can also go the other way. If the press is clearly not fulfilling its role to let people know what's going on and present the dangers, we should withdraw funding. I think if something like the Washington Post goes under, we shouldn't reflexively view that as a bad thing. I think we are probably entering a more diffuse media sphere, and one of the things about the right is they pay their propagandists, right? There is an incredible amount of money coming from above and below, from like the big libertarian think tanks that are funded by people like the Koch brothers, to also if you have like a YouTube channel and you rail against social justice warriors and how feminism is toxic and it's stopping young men from getting laid, your audience will give you a lot of money. The left doesn't. And people who want to see an independent media that is truth-driven, that is not politically partisan, but is unequivocally in support of liberal democracy, I think we need to think a bit more laterally about, does that mean just subscribing to the New York Times and Washington Post? Because those institutions are profoundly failing right now. And, they will sneer and say, you, a podcaster, can't just say, oh, we're going to get rid of institutional journalism and just have podcasts. I'm not saying that, although some of the best press that's existed in the Trump administration actually has been from podcasts. Like, I'll give maybe one example, the Prosecuting Donald Trump podcast, which is by lawyers who do real reporting. They go and they sit in the Trump trials and, have that function. And have just covered it infinitely better than the mainstream press has, which is not even to say in a more hostile way, but in a way that, when I listen to them, I actually understand what's happening in a way that I often don't when I read legal coverage in sort of heritage press media. And, even for myself, right, I am not an investigative journalist, and I'm not going to be sitting in the courtroom reporting on that or talking to sources like Bob Woodward does, but, there is an opinion and commentary function embedded within legacy media that I think is hugely important in a moment like this. Like I said in this episode, the value of philosophy and history of political thought should be trying on different frameworks, questioning the assumptions that you have, giving people the tools and resources to formulate what they want to say and their own anti-fascism in their own words, to have thought it through for themselves. I think that's incredibly practically valuable. Now, not all of commentary, not all of educational podcasts have to be about that. Sometimes things can just be interesting because they're interesting without a political payoff. But in the case of political commentary and opinion, I think it produces a number of goods, but one of them is a political payoff. And as someone who's been at a low level, and for far fewer people, doing political opinion, political commentary, I can't help but notice, and this might seem a bit whatever of me, just how poor the vast majority of opinion and commentary from something like the New York Times is. They're not like, oh, let's do a column telling our reader about Hobbes and how that might play into stuff. They're not, half of them just run the same column again and again and again, where they complain about the supposed excesses of the anti-free speech left and mew for civility and compromise. Even the ones whose politics I might align with strike me often as lazy and unresearched. So I don't think the challenge with media is simply defunding it. I do think there's a thing where, we need to fund what we think is valuable, and that might not be simply just having a New York Times, subscription. It might be picking out a range of media across a range of different formats and forums that we think is providing the immune system response that we want it to provide. I mean, that almost sounded like I'm trying to pitch sponsor. This isn't an ad to sponsor the podcast. You know what? It's my podcast. I can talk about what I want. It kind of is an ad to sponsor the podcast. I would say, go and support on Patreon. I think especially people who are covering the justice system and Trump well and really letting people know what's going on there. I think that's been incredibly valuable. To the extent that there are mainstream media outlets who are still doing their job, support them. And I don't think it's the be-all and end-all, but yes, I do think opinion and commentary is valuable when it has thought and care and love and research put into it. And I think most political commentary isn't. I think a lot of mainstream political chat is very, very lazy and vibes based, and just them regurgitating themselves, essentially. Oh, well, this particular thing got a lot of buzz in the media. They're just talking in a circle at each other. So, yeah. All of which is to say, so yeah, how we save the Republic is you support the podcast on Patreon. No, I'm joking, obviously. I do think, and I've gone on a bit of a rant about this, just as I said with the far left, we need to think about the fact that this isn't an inflexible railing that's artificial and that just sort of exists and works by itself. These systems are composed of people, right? People who perform their immune system roles more or less well, and people whose labour can't simply be assumed, right? One of the reasons the far right wins is because it pays its propagandists and its activists. I think a lot of the reasons people go from being like your Jimmy Dores of the world or your Dave Rubins, from being like a lefty commentator to a right-wing one, is I don't think they've had some ideological revelation. I think they want to get paid. I think it's that simple. That doesn't justify them. I think that those are both pretty despicable human beings. But that's the reality. I think we need to find a way to materially support far-left activism. I think we need to find ways to materially support the types of media that we want. And, honestly hold accountable and divest from media, even if it has a noble heritage, like the New York Times, that's no longer doing what it should be doing. College-educated, affluent liberals are the ones who have New York Times subscriptions. If they're not doing what they should be, we shouldn't fund them to do it. That was a bit of a rant on media, but that's where I'm at with that. I think if Trump wins, and if you're listening to this when Trump wins, the media is really going to come at us cap in hand saying you have to support the New York Times, otherwise democracy will die. And I'm not really sure we should fall for the same trick twice. I think we're going to have to put some thought and critical thinking in to how we create a sort of vibrant, maybe more decentralised media ecosystem that does what they no longer can. I hope to play a very, 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 very small part of this in contributing to opinion and commentary and analysis. Okay. What falls out of all this, then? To conclude, I've created a metaphor and I've talked through it. Here's what sort of falls out of it. As I've said, yeah, it's a counterintuitive situation. The American body politic is being finished off by a flu that we should be able to fight, and we're seemingly healthy, but all of our natural immune systems are at a low ebb, and we're especially vulnerable right now. Serious illness doesn't always follow from injury. We have this narrative about democratic collapse that it emerges from economic desperation. The hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic led to Nazism. That can be part of it, but even historically I think that narrative is overrated. Just like a body can take a wound and it can become infected, that is a thing that can happen. But it's not the only way that you can become seriously ill. Now, we've gone over this, and it's a narrative that really appeals to people, that they turn to fascism because they're economically desperate. But that's not the case. There is no wound. America is a very prosperous society, and those people who within it who are very poor are not the ones most likely to support Trump. Rather, our vulnerability is a combination of a number of different but interlinked failures. Getting back to health will involve clearing the virus from the body and then simultaneously improving all of those immune systems. Now here's the thing, and here's why I spent so long on switching our metaphor from Newtonian to body politic. The systems that protect the body aren't automatic and mechanical. There are no guardrails. It's things different parts of the body does. And this all requires work and effort from different groups of cells in the body, i.e. people in the body politics. When we talk of guardrails and checks and balances, we're assuming the work of other people. It's not that the guardrails will protect me, it's that other people will work to clean up my mess. That's the attitude that we've been carrying on with. In many ways, it's that attitude that has worn our immune systems down to this low point, where we're now so vulnerable that a common cold or flu can finish us off. And in many ways it's philosophic. We've neglected our immune systems to the point of total societal failure, because we haven't thought of ourselves as having immune systems. We've thought of ourselves as having guardrails. Guardrails that are proved completely illusory when the time comes. As I said, it is a strange, sad way for a superpower to die.